Oh, there she is. Yes, no, that leads nowhere. And as you could see in this beautiful work of Christian Nyampeta, he uses cinema as a communal learning environment where the characters, the fictional real characters, are having a discussion. So maybe it's a nice allegory which we can continue live now on the stage, being in a theater, in a cinema. And to start, I would like to first introduce the speakers on the stage. And on my left side, next to me, we have Angela Vettese, who is associate professor at Iuav University in Venice. Iuav University in Venice, Faculty of Arts and Design, where she is the founder and director of the Visual Art Graduate Program. Next to her, we have Alexander Halberstadt. Alexander Halberstadt is a senior writer at the Museum of Modern Art. His most recent book, a family memoir titled Young Heroes of the Soviet Union, was a New York Times Critics' Top Book of 2020. He contributes to the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, and other publications, and teaches at New York University. And next to Alexander, we have Jurriaan Cooiman. And Jurriaan is a founder and director of CULTURESCAPES, a Swiss multidisciplinary biennial. Recent focus of the biennial were 2021 Amazonas, 2019 Poland, 2017 Greece, 2015 Iceland. Now he is preparing for the 2023 edition on the Sahara and 2025 Himalaya. So we're gathering here, 4 of us and 3 of you as representatives of institution, because our topic is decoloniality in the institutions and what could be our strategies or are our strategies on that topic. So I would like to ask all of you to have a short statement, and if it's okay, Jurriaan, I would like to start with you and give the word first to you so you can give us a little bit insights in your practice, institutional practice on the topic.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's not easy after this very content of the movie in the morning and yesterday to step in, and I will try to use my personal experience as a reference to the questions raised so far. These are going a bit beyond the current war and invasion, but they have to do with it in a certain way, since the festival CULTURESCAPES, like landscapes, you say CULTURESCAPES, started in 2003 with an edition on Georgia. That was the first CULTURESCAPES and what we did. It's a multidisciplinary festival, and as it happened in 2003, the moment was chosen a long time before. The Rose Revolution was literally at the same days of a discussion. The discussion which had the title made long time before, Georgia, Where You Go. And we had the son of Kamsa Khoudia, who then lived, the former president who was kicked out, living in Switzerland, and it was a very heated discussion, but actually we had a cultural festival. So it made me feel this is a good thing, actually, that it's always related to big questions. The next edition was Ukraine. I was not yet acquainted with Ukraine as I am now, but out of curiosity towards the former Soviet Empire and the way in the Netherlands, I'm raised in the Netherlands, it was sort of unified as one big entity. We have been talking about this. I just had my own interest in differentiating this. So the second edition on Ukraine, again, was happening during the Orange Revolution. And literally when the first Maidan was happening, we had the discussion again, and it was again a very political one. Oleg Skripka from Gruppe VV was on the stage, he gave concerts, his voice was almost gone. And again it became very clear, we are witnessing something in the political landscape, and we having a cultural edition of a festival. Well, this went on, 2005 Armenia, 2006 Estonia, 2007 Romania, 2008 we made a step to Turkey. we were sort of questioning what kind of image do we have as audiences and as cultural practitioners from those places, those identities, and how can we reflect on those identities through art, and maybe changing the image we have from it, allowing actually by this doubting the image we were raised with towards the image we got from when we experience, and by this self-doubting the image we have from ourselves, in a way a process of decolonizing the self by doubting what are we really standing on. And the image of the white paper in the movie just now just made me clear that it's almost impossible to go beyond where you're standing on, because that's where you're standing on. So the places we take in the world with our feet are, as we know, full of things from the past we have only the results of, the privilege of, in my case. And to be aware of this in a movie like this makes actually more, let's be silent, because we are mainly part of the issues raised in this movie. In another level of deconstructing or decolonizing, we left the country-oriented festival topics with the Europe trilogy. You mentioned Iceland, Greece, Poland, because the nation state as such we saw as creating more problems than giving solutions. And we are now in the middle of a cycle of biennials in the meantime, not anymore yearly, but biennials, towards the Amazon last year, and next year Sahara, and then Himalaya, and then oceans. By this, going beyond the nation-state construction and seeing that solutions can only be found by a wider perspective and higher altitude of your gaze, and being faced with the variety of other point of views from indigenous knowledges. The CULTURESCAPES Festival collaborate with partner institutions. We are in ourselves a rather small structure, but we work with 40, 50 different institutions, which in Switzerland, where we work, are very heavily specialized. And we are challenging our partners, our presenting partners, with these kinds of topics. Each time again, there's the question, how far can you go with suggested programs and artists? And by this, something happens, of course, also to widen the scope of experiences for them as our major shareholders, and the audiences we together generate. In a way, also a decolonization of, or at least the try to widen the art experience. Decolonizing art in itself is, for me, already a problem. It looks like that art is in itself a colonized product. There is almost nothing you can think of as before. Seeing the Benin part of this movie brought me to the experience I had myself when I visited the Republic of Benin and the Kingdom of Dahomey, where also in the same time as the movie talks about, sculptures were taken away and brought to France and other places. And now, last year, I was witnessing the exhibition when the first 27 objects were given back and were presented. It is 27 objects of 3,000 France has.
4,000.
It's like 1 promille. And it was celebrated in a huge way. And many questions came up there, which we can talk about. Two of them are the 125 years they were gone from where they come from, there was only an empty spot there. They lost the connection of the meaning of the works by taking and being presented and being preserved in Europe. Where they were in Europe and where they were not in Africa. When they were brought back, they made a huge exhibition where those objects from the 19th and 18th century were behind glass. You couldn't see or feel or touch them. It was absolutely becoming a piece of art. And in the spaces next door, it was in the presidential palace, they had an exhibition of contemporary art, sort of reflecting on the traditions. These reflections, though, were all academic arts imposed on them by the colonizers. So there's a double missing link here. They were not able to stay in contact with their ancestry because the objects were gone. And when they came back, they lost trace, and they counterpointed this with, in a way, a canonic way of seeing art in an academic point of view. And this brings me to the question, it is almost impossible to reach a point out of which real steps can be made others than trying.
Thank you so much. I hear your point, but can you say whether there were artists from the region invited to the contemporary part?
There were only African artists, only from the Republic of Benin, and that's a very vibrant scene, but academic. Our way of seeing art in the frames we do, in the objectified element of art, sculptures, some videos, and a lot of painting of the black body. And let me add one more thing there. The production in the experiences we are witnessing when we do research trips to the Amazon or to Africa, in performing arts and also in arts, is very often made for there where they know money can come from. So even there, when a choreographer like Lia Rodriguez from Rio de Janeiro is producing, she still does it knowing that the whole co-production budget is coming from European festival partners. And she can hardly show the work in Brazil. So it is a continuous colonial dependency being established, and cultural practitioners such as myself, festival director or curators, they're still tapping into this problem. You cannot avoid it almost.
Mm-hmm. But we cannot avoid it, it's completely true, I can agree, but we still can work on it, and at least we're talking about it already openly, which is, I think, is a shift which is happening right now. So just to bring the discussion a little bit back to Ukraine and Ukrainian situation right now, maybe you can tell us what is your festival at the moment is doing on that topic. How do you support the decolonizing process?
I'm a member of the European Festival Association. It's the oldest association of festivals. It's 70 years old. We will celebrate this in 2 weeks in Jurriaan. In Jurriaan. And shortly after the war started, I wrote to them, make sure that there are no Russian members anymore allowed. And if you don't make sure, they had a board meeting, I will leave. They had this last board meeting 10 days before the war started in Russia, in the festival of Sochi. And it was so amazing to hear them, we will just go there because we are invited by the winter festival there, and we have been there more often, and we will do so. And I say, but don't you see the threat of what's happening there and the amount of army is being around Ukraine? Are you sure you want to do a European Festival Association's board meeting there now? They did it, they came back, and I wrote them what I just mentioned before. What we did in the meantime is that there are no Russian members anymore. And we started an initiative for partnering up between Ukrainian festivals and members of the European Festival Association, so that there is sort of a buddy system between, for example, our festival, CULTURESCAPES, with the construction festival in Dieppe. And there are other members, colleagues of mine from the European Festival Association who are membering with with the Gogol, or with the Kharkiv Music Fest, with Odessa Classics, or with Lviv Ancient Music. And we try to bring in this topic in the agenda of the European Festival Association, noticing that the main part of the members, they still program for them big Russian culture. And they don't doubt it. And it's really challenging now, because in the meeting now in Yerevan, the Ukrainian festivals who found a partner in the association will also be invited, and will facing this kind of, let's say it mildly, ignorance towards the very sensitive issues. I am extremely supporting this. It was my idea actually to bring up this topic, to do something on the level I can do something, to bring in networks where I'm part of another way of thinking with colleagues who I might be able to reach, other than sending money, which is also good and need to be done as well. But nothing is as powerful as the right idea at the right moment. And maybe we can say this moment is really there now to feed in with right ideas, to change the attitude and the programming. Because when we repeat what we have done again and again, the repetition becomes the standard, becomes the canon, and then we have all the time more of the same. And we should not wonder when a more of the same in institutional practices will lead to a moment where we ask, can those institutions be decolonized at all after the amount of repetition they keep on doing, because they think the audience want it, the programmers are doing it, the media react, we keep on doing this. It's the same cycle. And we should not wonder when certain institutions may fail on this and may leave. And I think it would be an amazing idea also in Switzerland that the 3 or 4 generation of art spaces and institutions, like the big orchestras and museums which are there forever and like dinosaurs, then the theaters and orchestras which are founded a bit later, and then in the 70s the independent spaces came up, they are institutionalized now themselves. It becomes like unbearable much of the same. And maybe in this time of chaos and questioning, some of them might just need to leave and leave space for something else, which doesn't need to go through a decolonization process, but can start in a very different way. As we have seen Documenta, it is possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because festivals have a little bit more fluid structure than said institutions. Thank you so much, Jurriaan. I think I would give the word to Angela as a representative of education institution, but also somebody who knows very well Venice Biennial and the structure. So please make your statement.
I was asked to just talk a bit about our program here in Venice. I founded and I'm leading the graduate course in visual arts at the Iuav University, and now I am leading the PhD program. And of course, we are colonized. We are part of the problem. Italy. Italy has always relied on the States, United Kingdom, Germany, France. From the point of view of contemporary art, we are a weak country. So it was my pleasure to invite a number of American and English and German artists, which I did. I also try to counterbalance this by inviting, let's say, Slovenian artists like the Irvin group, or Bosniak artists like Maja Bajevic, or I'm very proud to say that Marta Kucma, who was the director of the Soros Center in Kiev for 10 years, started teaching here. And then it turned out that she became the dean of the Yale School of Art. And she is half Ukrainian, as you may know. I mean, she is Ukrainian, but she has been educated in the States. So, and also, for example, Adrian Pazzi, who comes from Albania, has been teaching with us. And so, of course, I've been quite attentive, and also, as Tatiana well knows, we started focusing on the Ukrainian situation in our program, PhD program, by having her with us, and also Vasin Cherepating? Yes, okay. I don't know the pronunciation. So we try to put within our PhD program also the Ukrainian situation, like the ongoing Ukrainian situation. Having said this, I would go back to our, like, let's say, inevitable situation of complexity in terms of being colonized. And strangely enough, it's my opinion, a controversial opinion, but I strongly think that it is like a good opinion, that the national pavilions at the Venice Biennale are a way to help decolonizing. They have been accused to lie on the Fichtean, let's say, idea of nation, like the 19th century idea of nation, and they have been accused to follow an imperialist idea, but actually they turn out to be, especially in the second post-war period, a way to escape from the not only United States kingdom or imperialism, cultural imperialism, but also from the imperialism of the art system itself. Because the art system has been based on a number of globetrotter curators, basically coming from Switzerland, from United Kingdom, United States, France, but basically coming from a little number of countries, okay? Nor Russia nor Ukraine have been part of that. And sometimes, yes, we do have Italian curators of a certain importance, but not by chance, sort of all of them have been living in the States. So, what really rules the art system is a certain kind of education. You can name it, like the places where one good curator can be working, and the kind of jobs that they have as a basic job, apart from being independent curators. And every time you read, you go through a top 100 on art review, you see that there is a certain unifying reading of the visual art culture. So I think that the national pavilions at the Venice Biennale can help us to escape this monocratic way of thinking, which is reflected by Art Forum, which is reflected by October, which is reflected by the Columbia University. Maybe you do, no, you teach it other, but still. I mean, there are places that are neuralgic, and wherever you have maybe a bad Egyptian or Morocco or Brazilian pavilion here in Venice, still it's really relevant because you can have access to a kind of not always grassroots, but somehow diverse intervention, something that you would never see in a central show at the Venice Biennale, the main show at the Venice Biennale. You would never see in Documenta, you would never see in one of the many, like Sydney, Istanbul, and so on and so forth, biennials, the big shows that have interchangeable names and in terms of curators, but also artists. So let's say that, quoting Howard Becker, the sociologist, The art word is not one, there are several art words, and still there is one main way of thinking that runs our identities and runs our cultural identity also in terms of population. So me as an Italian, I'm obliged to agree with certain rules that come from the art system, the main art word. So let's say that the system of foreign pavilion, of national pavilions at the Venice Biennale help us to have a glance, at least, on what happens in different countries. Of course, they started by being national pavilions of the capitalistic world, so Belgium, Holland, Germany, France, United Kingdom were the first. But then, after the 50s, little by little, we arrived to sort of 100 national pavilions, which means that all the continents have been represented. Of course, only as a part of the jury, when I was part of the jury, I had the strength, the possibility and the time to go through all of them. I don't think that any normal visitor of the Venice Biennale goes through all of them, but the catalog stays. And somehow this is a way to stay in touch with the dialect of art and not only the main language. This is the strange international English that we are obliged to speak, but which is an advantage, of course, but it also brings with it certain kind of disadvantages. I would like to point out another thing. The national pavilions are not always national, and this is really interesting because, for example, in 1997, the Nordic Pavilion was hosting Mark Diane, who was American, was hosting Mariko Mori, who was Japanese, and then two Nordic artists like Erik Akkansson. In the last 20 years, if you give a look to the Spanish pavilion, you can see people, I mean artists, who have left closed the pavilion itself. Speaking about Santiago Sierra, who also covered the name of the pavilion, or Dora Garcia, who decided that the pavilion itself was not enough, and she had to relate to the local communities here in Venice, and she decided to have her main activities all over the town, or you can have artists like for example, artists who exchanged the pavilion of Germany, France, and United Kingdom have been exchanging their places in the last editions, so as to confuse whether the building was like the real embassy for that country. It was not. So there is a kind of institutional critique going on in the national pavilions, which is stronger in the national pavilions than in the main show. I mean, the certain kind of experiments are stronger and more radical in the national pavilion than in the main show. And I can't but remember also the pavilions of nations that do not exist. Population without a nation. The Armenian pavilion in 2015, held at the Isola degli Armeni, who won the prize, by the way, was representing a diasporic population. I also had René Gabri, an Armenian artist, teaching in my university, by the way. He was part of that pavilion. So, nation without a populations without a nation. Armenians, but also, let's say, Catalans. There has been a Catalan pavilion. There has been a pavilion of Wales. We can also have doubts about the right of these sort of pieces of nations to be represented, because especially speaking from an Italian point of view, it is as if the northern part of Italy wanted its own pavilion. It looks very much on the right. It looks very much against the south. But what if something like that had happened in the years of the Soviet Union? What if the Ukrainian minority, let's say, within the Soviet Union would have liked to have its own pavilion? It could have been like an act of resistance against the cultural invasion of a main partner. So I think that also these kind of experiments are very interesting. And last but not least, I would say that many of these pavilions, both official and not official, act as little embassies, act as little representatives, and show the disponibility, the possibility to use the biennial as a place for discussing problems that are not topics of the main show. And I want to remind a pavilion organized by Lithuania, not in the art biennial, but in the architecture biennial, Gediminas Urbonas, Nomedas Urbonas, and many others, organized in 2016, if I'm not 18, a show about swamps. Swamps means, of course, environmental worries. The swamps are rich places, but also have been betrayed by human development. We should never forget that the lagoon is an artificial swamp. It's a swamp, but it's artificial because the lagoon is, the destiny of any lagoon is to disappear, and we kept existing the lagoon by acting on it, like blocking a river, putting barriers, and so on. So that pavilion, the Lithuanian pavilion, actually was a pavilion dedicated to the topic of swamps. And the topic of swamps both kept together the main problem of Venice, one of the main problems of Venice, and the whole over problem of ambientalism, of environment, of the violence that humankind does to the land, but also the need for technologies, human technologies, in order to keep the environment a good place to live in. So, I mean, I know I'm being very, I had like 10 pages to read, but I decided that it's not the case. So I know that I can look very superficial, but as a statement, this is all I can say. Let's try to understand that the art system can be very violent, and we are not under the empire of one or two or three nations. We are under the empire of a kind of circulation of the art works, which is increasingly copying the circulation of the capital, and within the capitalistic circulation of goods, we are copying more and more the systems of high finance. So I think that we should use every possible institution, from universities to magazines to the national pavilions, to try to diminish this danger, the danger of like relating too much artworks and finance.
Thank you, Angela. I think we'll save our questions for after the last presentation, and I would give the word to Alex. And I know you prepared something also visual for us, but.
Thank you, Maria. I just wanted to say that unlike most of us here, I'm not a curator or scholar. I'm a writer and journalist and a professor of writing. And at MoMA, where I've been since 2019, I edit the magazine and teach writing, and am involved in all aspects of our communication. And I wanted to say that for us, I think maybe it's appropriate that I'm the one presenting this because our focus has been very strongly on not only speaking to our curatorial colleagues and our colleagues in art history, but speaking to the general public. Our museum, more than half of the visitors to MoMA are from outside of the United States. And one of the things that I think especially during the pandemic that the museum has committed to is speaking in a very accessible way to as broad of an audience as possible. And I wanted to share a presentation about some of the ways we have responded to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and kind of the many fronts that we've tried to speak about this issue with. And actually, Jurriaan, would you mind switching seats with me? I don't think my neck is that flexible anymore. So I think one of the first initiatives that we started, this began in February of this year, was we deinstalled a gallery of avant-garde Russian art and installed a gallery of Ukrainian art, which is titled In Solidarity. And what we've done essentially is to create a gallery where every artist was born on the territory of Ukraine. And we've also removed, in the cards accompanying the works, we've removed the artist's nationality and simply put in their place of their birth and the place of their death. This is a conversation now we're having institution-wide because I think imposing a nationality on an artist can be a colonizing gesture. And we have essentially presented this work by artists who are traditionally thought of as Ukrainian, by artists who I think in some cases surprised our visitors by being born in Ukraine. So this gallery includes Kazimir Malevich, Alexander Archipenko, Vladimir Baranov-Rasine, Vladimir Burlyuk, Olga Dineyko, Sonia Delaney-Turk, Louise Nevelson, Milton Resnick, Ilya Kabakov, Vasil Yermilov, Janet Sobel, the photographer Ouija, who, as turns out, was born in Ukraine. And so this gallery really has begun a conversation at MoMA about what it means to come from a particular place. It has begun a conversation about nationality and ethnicity, and clearly in the case of Ukraine, which has been occupied first by the Russian Empire and later by the Soviet Union, this seems like a particularly lively and pertinent conversation. So in addition to this gallery, which, and the one thing I forgot to mention is you'll see on your right that there is a poem by the Ukrainian poet Serhiy Zhadan, which appears in Ukrainian and in English. There's a link there that goes to the full poem on Magazine, which is a publication for general readers that I edit. And I wanted to also share some of the content that we've published as part of Magazine. Let's see. These are more views of the gallery. It is titled In Solidarity, and it was installed by curators and other members of our staff from across all of the different departments. It was a kind of a museum-wide conversation that we had in February. So on February 11th, before the full-scale invasion actually started, we asked an illustrator from Kiev named Anna Servira, who is also the head of a society of illustrators in Kiev, to make essentially a illustrated story for us about what it was like in the run-up to the invasion, and she gave us a really moving and beautiful work of art that you can see on the website. We, of course, put up more work by Serhiy Zhadan and some images from the gallery. This is a piece by Louise Nevelson. That is something I will share a little bit later. And also in June, for Pride Month, we interviewed two really wonderful LGBTQ activists in Ukraine, Yuri Dvizhon of Ukraine Pride, who are based in Kiev, and Elena Shevchenko of an organization called Insight, which has 12 chapters, or 13 chapters in Ukraine. I think 3 of them are now closed because of the Russian occupation, to speak about, you know, the particular risks and challenges that the queer population of Ukraine are facing during this war, particularly trans-Ukrainians who are facing some really, really intense challenges in moving around the country and leaving the country, etc. And finally, I wanted just to talk about some of the other initiatives. We are right now working on a number of programs. One of them is a program for conservation professionals in Ukraine. We are sending a number of materials to Ukrainian conservators who are helping them to essentially preserve and protect Ukrainian artistic heritage. These are things that are simply requested, things to essentially, that they need and cannot get because of the political situation. We're also working on a number of events and other initiatives. Right now we have a knowledge base at MoMA, which has books and library materials, much of which have been contributed by the Ukrainian Institute. Thank you, Tatiana, and your team. And this is essentially for journalists and researchers who want to come and do work and do research in our libraries. We're also starting a program of research grants that will bring Ukrainian museum professionals to MoMA. Again, thank you, Tatiana, we're doing that with the Ukrainian Institute as well. We also have a publication called Post, which is for curators and arts professionals, and we've had 2 really wonderful pieces by Svetlana Bedreva and Natasha Klimenko, who've written about decolonization. For that, we also have a CMAP group. CMAP stands for Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives. It is a study group for curators and other museum professionals. I'm a member of the Eastern European group, which has had presentations every month by curators and by other scholars from the former Soviet Union. And in the CMAP group organizes trips every year to the region for MoMA's employees. Gosh, I'm sorry, I know this sounds like a catalog of things, but I just wanted to, I feel like an awkward presenter at the Oscars. I'm trying to thank everybody before the music starts, so please forgive me. We are also having an event later in this fall called Post Presents Art Resistance and New Narratives in Response to the War in Ukraine. It'll be on an in-person event on October 12th, which will have Svetlana Bedreva, Eva Suliak, Lesia Khamenko, and Nikita Kadan in conversation with Polina Babocha, who is our curator of painting and sculpture. And also we're planning an event for possibly early December, which will feature Tim Snyder from Yale University, who's a historian of Eastern Europe, Masha Gessen, who is a renowned journalist who has been writing a lot in the West about the Ukraine invasion. We are also hoping to have Marianna Kianovska, who is a wonderful Ukrainian poet whose book was just translated and is coming out with Harvard University Press. And we're talking about some special surprise guests with Tatiana, which will hopefully work out. So thank you for sitting through that catalog. And just on a lighter note, I wanted to share a short video. It's 3 minutes long. That is part of a series we do called Art Speaks. It is a series in which staff members talk about one work of art from MoMA's collection. And I think in the following one, you will recognize the presenter. My name is Alex Halberstadt, and I'm a senior writer here at the Museum of Modern Art. We're looking at Janet Sobel's Milky Way, which she painted in 1945. I chose this painting because I became completely fascinated with Janet Sobel's story. I was born in the former Soviet Union, and my family, like Janet Sobel's, immigrated to the United States and settled in New York City. Janet Sobel was born Jenny Lichovsky in a shtetl in Ukraine, in what was then the Russian Empire. When she was a child, her father was killed in an anti-Semitic pogrom, and Jenny's mother and her siblings and her emigrated to the United States and settled in the Brighton Beach neighborhood of Brooklyn. The story goes that once she criticized her son's painting, and he threw down his art supplies and said, well, if you think you can do better, why don't you paint it yourself? And she took him up on it. She was already a grandmother when she began painting in the late 1930s. Her son was so impressed with what she painted that he sent images of Janet Sobel's work to a lot of prominent artists and writers who were really struck by it. And in the mid-1940s, Janet Sobel participated in a bunch of exhibitions in New York City, including 2 solo shows, one of which happened at Peggy Guggenheim's famous gallery, Art of the Century. It was also during this time that a young American artist named Jackson Pollock came to see her shows and was reportedly quite struck by them. When I look at Milky Way, I like to think about the way Janet Sobel created it. There's something about it that feels incredibly meticulous and done entirely for one's own pleasure in the privacy of one's own home. I like to think about her lying on her stomach on the floor of her apartment in her stockings and high heels, listening to music, and dripping paint using a glass eyedropper or a brush. Sometimes she blew on the paint to get it to move across the canvas. Sometimes she used her vacuum cleaner to move the paint around. Painting is interesting because there are these swirls of white against a field of color, magentas, lilacs, ochres, greens. I also love that it is titled after the Milky Way, which you can see in the night sky anywhere in the world, whether it's New York City or Ukraine. This painting was usually shown at this museum next to the larger canvases by Jackson Pollock. But today it's hanging in Gallery 507, which is a gallery that we installed as a tribute to the people of Ukraine who are currently at war. Every artist in this gallery was born on the territory of present-day Ukraine. This gallery is called In Solidarity. Part of what we tried to do is to show that Ukraine is a separate place, but also to acknowledge the complexity of the many people who live there. I think for the rest of her life, she was remembered mostly as a footnote to Jackson Pollock's career. She was often described as the artist who dripped paint before Jackson Pollock. But I actually think Janet Sobel had a much more interesting story. The work in this gallery is a reminder that one needs a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of peace to create art. And I love the idea of her in her Brighton Beach apartment and making the work not out of fear or obligation, but because she wanted to.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, all three of you, but I guess I will start with my first question right to Alex, and I already warned you that I will be asking this because I think it's generally important for all the institutions to think. It's amazing how much is now done actually for Ukraine, for Ukrainian artists, and how collections and institutions are starting to have a precise look on their own collections, invite finally Ukrainian voices. But this war is happening since 2014, as we all know, and it was, I guess, very hard for Ukrainians to reach the institutions until 2022, the February 2022, because somehow Ukrainian voices were not heard, and especially in case of MoMA, we know, we have Tatiana here who tried to bring MoMA to even to hang the painting in the right way, and that her voice was neglected, unheard for years, and until the full-scale invasion, when this painting finally was hung in the right way, as we saw in your image. And so I guess these positive developments which you were just describing are amazing on one hand, but we as representatives of institution need to continue thinking, how can we keep that and even more intensify it so we don't fall back into what was happening before the full-scale invasion? Because I don't know, I mean, maybe you can say something in the role of MoMA in that, and why Ukrainian voice is so not important. I mean, sorry, that you need to answer that question, because of course, not always you.
I appreciate the question, Maria. I personally was not at MoMA in 2014, so I can't speak personally to what happened there. You know, I think the one thing that I can say is that we have a lot of conversations institution-wide about responses to political crises around the world. The museum has a long-standing policy of not issuing political statements and responding to these events through programming and through the kind of content that we generate and through various programs that we are, you know, that is in our wheelhouse, you know, in art and culture and journalism. You know, often these conversations are really difficult because there are many interests, some of which I find to be really valid, others, you know, perhaps less so. I obviously speak only for myself, not on behalf of MoMA's leadership. It's an institution with almost 1,000 employees. But the conversations that we have are intense, and they are, much of our staff is extremely engaged in what is going on. And all I can really say is that we are trying to get better. It is a continuing journey of self-improvement. And clearly, looking back, do I wish we had done more in 2014? Absolutely. I can't speak exactly to why, but it is something that I think the most generative thing we can do as an institution is to be better and to look forward and to use sort of, past mistakes as a way of improving our future responses.
Yeah, I can only add, because working for a lot of institutions, I see myself the shift, and it just saddens me that we needed this full-scale invasion to actually shift the focus. It would be great if that would have not been the real reason. But how do you feel about it in your institutions? Maybe Jurriaan and Angela, you could also respond to it. How did it change since the full-scale invasion, the focus on Ukrainian voices, and in that sense?
Well, as I told, it was relevant to me to show immediately what the centrality, the autonomy of Ukraine culture was about. I mean, it is not so easy for us, in Italy, to understand that the culture coming from Ukraine is autonomous, is something definitely separated with its own language and its own tradition and its own legacy. Not only compared with Russian culture, but with the old Eastern European culture. So we are inclined to think that the Eastern European culture is like a melting pot that is very interconnected, and still is. So we thought that, as a general attitude, of course, there are people who are much more in part of the situation, but as a general feeling, the idea was that the former Soviet Union area of influence and all those countries that go from, let's say, Poland on, in terms of going east, were interconnected, were debating one with the other, and although we know that there are rivalries, economical basically rivalries, but also ethnical or cultural rivalries, we didn't think that the level of conflict was so high, even if, of course, the invasion of Crimea was a starting point to get attentive and try to understand what was going on, and we are fearful of Putin. We are fearful of such a big Russia, and it's a whole geopolitical balance that we are fearing, and the changes that lead to the importance of China and to the possibility to be eaten by China. I would say that this is the last fear that we have. And somehow to defend the autonomy and the importance of certain areas, and the first one is Ukraine, allow us to feel safer in terms of, if the boundaries that divides us from China is stronger, then it's better for us. So I'm sorry to include Ukraine within a bigger frame, but I think we have no way out. We have to think in global terms. So
Of course. No, I hear you, but as we all say, Ukraine is fighting for all of our values at the moment, but it's feeling itself sometimes very much alone, because European countries, Germany included, where I'm based right now, you always need to make work a lot on explaining, and this explanation of the position of Ukraine can be very tiring. So that's why, as institutions, we have a role in it, and I feel it's a very important role, and I feel museums especially, but also of course universities and biennials, we need to think how we can make it long term, because we don't know how long this war will going on, and we cannot get tired. We don't have the right to get tired. It's too early. So I think as an institutions and as curators, as writers, as directors and professors, we need to think what could be our roles within our own institutions, also to think long term, to continue this decolonizing process, to support Ukraine, to support this autonomous role of Ukraine, because they are fighting for all of us and for our values. So I don't know, like, do you already think for the future? Because we're trying, I mean, in Dresden, our museums in Dresden, we can only make a big show next year. We're not capable to do it this year. And in the beginning, I was very angry about it. I was like, why cannot we do something immediate? Because big museums are slow. But now I think it's actually maybe even better that we're doing it next year, because it means that it's not reactionary, but it also, the message is continuous. You know, like it's not just one momentum, but we building a long-term strategies how to include Ukraine on the map and give it an important position. So I don't know, maybe you can say something in that.
Well, not directly to this, but to think again in a global sphere of interest, I think is a step backwards, which I think is not reflecting where the world is and where it's heading to. And institutions, they play a very important role if they are aware of the fact that we having very much post-migrantic societies, which means to be included in the way institutions are run, and not only run as a structure, but also in the way they program and in their boards. And I think the question of boards, so who decides actually in what direction strategically institutions are going, needs to be needs to be reflected the societies we're living in. And as long as that is not the case, we should not be surprised that we create more of the same. And it requires quite some courage, I think, and things to try to have another form of recruiting personnel, very concretely, but also working it upwards towards boards. If there is no equivalent in the board, you will never reach anything which decolonize art institutions, because it stays in the same structure of way of thinking. So they are too dangerous, falling back into the global sphere of interest and finding this balance again, but also to stay in the way of a completely white-dominated canonic cultural thinking and carrying by boards and personnel. And we have to change that.
But as we heard today, very nicely brought up by Madina, it's a process. There is never an ending point to it. So you know, like, which I found a really important message from today, that we only because we think it's not reachable, it cannot stop us by trying to continue and develop our strategies and improve them.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think, you know, to speak to this idea of the global art community, which is a beautiful idea, but I think in reality is sometimes, you know, hindered by colonialism, by war, by repression, by, you know, various forms of discrimination that has been institutionalized and nationalized. And I just wanted to say that I think, you know, from a point of view working for a large institution like MoMA, one of the remits that we have is not focusing on one conflict like Ukraine, but, you know, but also working on conflicts in places like Beirut, in places like Cuba, where a lot of artists fighting for, you know, sort of freedom of artistic expression are being jailed and murdered right now. And, you know, one of the things that we've done with Russia is we have run a number of pieces by Masha Gessen, who speaks about the repression facing Russian artists right now by Putin's regime. We had an interview with Yulia Tsvetkova, who was a wonderful young graphic artist who was arrested and put in prison for 7 years for essentially depicting what the government described as homosexual propaganda. And, you know, essentially to remember that terror, you know, as we understand it, is not simply arrest or murder or war, but it is a system of self-censorship that essentially is imposed on the world's artistic communities. You know, I think much of the censorship that happens in places like Russia is perpetrated by the artists themselves, who are terrified of these seemingly random acts of punishment and repression. So I think it is important to always keep an eye on the entire world. You know, this is what's happening in Ukraine is tragic, but it is not unique, unfortunately. It's happening everywhere. And I think part of it is trying to respond when we can by, you know, by keeping that in mind. Unfortunately, there's a lot of there's a lot of oppression in the world, but I think as artists institutions we have to keep an eye on all of it and try to become involved to the degree that we can.
Yeah, for Ukrainians right now, it's very hard to speak about the Russian artists and their precarities. I need to be honest, compared to the precarities which Ukrainian artists are facing. But we, of course, we cannot compare the light. I'm sorry, light is a German word in English. Suffer. Yeah, it's very hard to compare the suffering. I think we'll only have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions from our wonderful audience. I don't know if somebody wants to add something. Yes, of course.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for your comments and reflections and for all the good work that you're doing. I actually wanted in my comments to tie this in with also the stunning film that we saw earlier, which I was not aware of myself, and which led me to a lot of reflections on how, indeed, if we look at the institutional history, how much it is implicated in very sort of repressive old 19th century ways of thinking, and how many museums have started the work of changing but have not with others. And for Ukraine, of course, this also brings the situation of objects from Ukraine, art, archaeological discoveries and things of that kind that were taken to the Russian Empire, and the recognition that with the things that we talked about, the Kingdom of Benin in the film, can very much be also talked about the situation of the plunder of art treasures of Ukraine. And this is again one of those issues where the world, while recognizing the horrors of colonialism and how they were perpetrated to places like Africa, and this is not making light of any of those horrors, but to include in that comparative perspective the very real situation that has been happening to Ukraine, and indifference from the return of some of the objects to Benin, indeed a minuscule amount, but that is something that the world has learned. I mean, nothing of the kind is happening to the art or objects of all kind that were taken from Ukraine. So my invitation to the panelists is to comment on how can this aspect of institutions like museums in how they think themselves in the future, and the educational role, which is where universities and festivals like the one we are at right now also can be part. So what can we do to change the ways in which this situation of thinking how an institution is constructed and how we can critically address those things from the past? How can it be continued, and how sort of a qualitative leap can be achieved, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to answer this question?
That's a very good question, and a very deep question. Thank you.
And I'm sorry we don't have much time for it.
Yeah, I'll make it very quick. You know, I think just speaking on behalf of the institution that I know, I think MoMA is certainly not exempt from the process of sort of colonial thinking, and the institution is now 90 years old. And I think one of the ways that we have tried to address that legacy, that really troubling legacy, is by we have started to rotate 1/3 of all the galleries every 6 months, and actually by sort of having different narratives around the work in the collection. I think one of the things that institutions can do is to create different narratives around works of art that seem familiar to us. One of the sort of paintings that everybody comes to see at MoMA is Demoiselle de l'Avignon by Picasso, and in the last time it was hung next to 2 other paintings, one by Louise Bourgeois and one by Faith Ringgold, which was based on Guernica. And so, even to put those works in different conversations, to create different contexts for viewing them, I think is one way to comment about things like privilege and access and coloniality. So I think institutions just have to think more critically and I think in less orthodox ways about the way that we present the things that we are known for. It doesn't have to be the same context. It doesn't have to be the same story, because Picasso is obviously now a figure that has been subject to a lot of critique, and I think fairly in some cases, in many cases. So I think that's one answer that I can mention.
Yeah, I can only add about the institution, my institution SKD in Dresden, that we hired a year ago a curator who is specializing on decolonizing process, and also we're reviewing the entire collection for the language, like in the titles of the works, which are now being renamed in a way which would not be offensive to minorities. And these are just few strategies which Museum Incorporated already knows that it's needed. We need it to do it, even though we're a very old institution. There is right now a big call for change, and of course it's baby steps. We're talking about baby steps, and where every big institution is aware that we need more and we need bigger steps, but it's a long process. And of course, I think inviting the voices from from outside and not Eurocentristic voices is also a very important step, which we're now changing. But it is in the big institutions, as you say. We're not as capable as maybe festivals to react more quickly to the needs.
Well, maybe to give another answer, what we are doing is that instead of only inviting artists and groups from West Africa or from the Amazon, we also look into the cityscape of Basel and what it has to do with the colonial past. We organize tours, Basel Colonial, and it's always crowded full with people because we tell the stories of what is the history behind this building. Oops, and oh, we didn't know that. Pharma industry, a tropical institute, university library, the Mission 21, which was sent to Africa too. So all those topics, we have to be more sensitive to where we live in and name the things by the name. And then it can be translated for all the other realities we are living in, which means also the conflicts we are facing right now. But without standing on the position where you are and looking there, you cannot talk only about it somewhere there. It's always also here.
Thank you, Jurri.
Yeah, I would like to add that knowing little by little what Ukraine is about, we came to learn that it was not peripheral, it was at a certain point very, very central. I would love to have a show, a book, a catalog, explaining, for example, that, if I'm not wrong, Malevich was from there. I mean,
there is such a book.
No, yes, there might be a centrality of St. Petersburg or Moscow in terms of places where these people were educated. But it is a fact that the majority of those who invented the artistic avant-garde in Eastern Europe were Ukraine, right? Were from Ukraine. And this is something we should know, and you should tell us clearly with a big show and with a wonderful catalog.
We're working on it, definitely.
Thank
And
you.
on this note, I will finish this panel, and I thank you all for participating. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But yeah, and thank you, our wonderful public, and for the questions and your attention. See you tomorrow. Exactly. See you tomorrow.